Well, thank you very much. We are very excited to bring you this conversation in just a couple minutes. Nick, we have two gentlemen who who were part of the prequel trilogy, just special effects, bringing it to life.
Mm-hmm.
Nick, this is kind of a big deal.
It's a huge deal. And I know you've talked about how this has been a dream of yours to have this conversation with these guys. And, you know, I'm such a sucker for behind the scenes and process and how these things get made, that this is truly a dream come true. And on a day like Podathon, you know, supporting Make-A-Wish, it's just perfect. I'm really excited.
Absolutely. Well, let's bring in our guests. Today we're joined by Rob Coleman and Hal Hickel. Gentlemen, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming. It's interesting, you know, Nick made that comment that he's a sucker for behind the scenes stuff. I'm a sucker for behind the scenes stuff. First, let me just ask you, you know, what's your current role at ILM, and maybe let's throw it all the way back to the very beginning of where we're going with this conversation around Phantom Menace, and talk a little bit about what your role specifically was on Phantom Menace. Rob, let me start with you.
Sure. Well, my current role is I'm the creative director for the ILM Sydney studio in Australia. And my history is that I started at ILM in 1993 and was moved up to be the animation director on Phantom Menace in 1997.
Excellent. Hal?
I'm senior animation supervisor at ILM in San Francisco. I started in 96. Phantom Menace was only my second project at ILM. I started that show as an animator. My Lost World, Jurassic Park was my first show at ILM, and then I came on at Phantom Menace.
Excellent. And I'm going to go off script just a little bit, because Rob, I mean, Hal, I think if I remember correctly, when we spoke, Rob brought you in for one particular character at one point for Phantom Menace, and that's kind of the doorway into it. Am I right about that?
Well, there were a couple things. One, I was dying to do anything with droids, and I took one of the pit droid characters before there was any shot work to do, and just animated a little vignette. And so Rob gave me some work to do on the Droidekas, the destroyer droids. Oh, you like droids? Okay, well, we've got this thing. We've got to figure out how it unfolds and walks and all that. And then he put me on the team under Linda Bell doing some Watto stuff. It was Linda, wasn't it, Rob, leading?
It was either Linda or or Tim Harrington. I can't remember now.
Yeah, I think
they did great work. They were.
And then you very kindly made me character lead on Boss Nass. So
yes,
and that was kind of the meat of my work on the film from that point on, was just doing all the Boss Nass scenes with a few other animators.
Did he say? He said, Hal, I need somebody who can make big floppy jowls and lots of spit.
Yeah, look at this.
Basically. Yes, exactly.
Well, guys, we are, as we talked about, celebrating the 25th anniversary of Phantom Menace. It's hard to believe, you know, that it's been that long. I was halfway through college at that point, and I remember going to see it the first night and all those memories. You guys got to work on it. Looking back on it over this time, maybe start with Hal on this one. What are you most proud of, as far as your work on Phantom Menace is concerned?
Well, that's a good question, because I think what I'm most proud of is just that I was there at the right time to be part of that show. It was a groundbreaking show. Like, in terms of my work specifically, I'm really happy with Nass. I think he's a great character, and I still enjoy his scenes. You know, anytime you do work and decades go by, you're going to notice the flaws, but I like him. I like Brian Blessed's voice. I like the whole thing. And I really dig the Droidekas. I'm really happy with those. But I think the thing that just makes me happiest was just that I was there at the right time to I'd always, like many people I know in visual effects, Star Wars was a huge factor in me pursuing a career in animation and visual effects. So cut to, all these years later, learning that Lucasfilm, that George was going to be making more Star Wars films, something that nobody thought was ever going to happen, especially people like me who were dying to work on a Star Wars film with George. That was just an absolute thrill. So that just being there and being part of it was the thing I'm most happy about. Look back with most fondness of.
For sure. Rob, what about you?
I have a very similar answer. I was 13 years old in 1977 when the first film came out, and I remember that was the first film I watched back to back. That was in Toronto, Canada. You were allowed, if you bought one ticket, you could just stay in the cinema. And my parents let me stay and watch it a second time without them. So it was this sort of big moment. And then I saw it countless more times that summer. Like Hal, you know, I was like, well, I skipped school to go see the first screening of Empire Strikes Back because I didn't want any spoilers from anybody. So I was a Star Wars, you know, fan. And then I remember going to Jedi, and then, you know, there was a rumored 6 or 9 films that George had talked about, but, you know, when was that going to happen? And, you know, now I'm probably 19 years old or something at this point, and, you know, kid in Canada, there's no way I thought that I was going to work on a Star Wars film, but as fate had it, I had the right skills, and there's computer animation software we were using at ILM at the time were Soft Image out of Montreal, where I'd gone to university, and Alias, which later became Maya, out of Toronto. So I knew both packages. And that's how I got to ILM, because I'd read that they built the dinosaurs with Alias and they'd animated it with Soft Image. So I wrote down, found a Canadian, wrote to them and said, hey, I know this stuff. And I ended up getting hired. And then when I was in there, 93, 94, George wasn't around. He was raising his kids. And you'd see him at Christmas parties or Halloween parties. He'd show up, but otherwise he wasn't around. And I was going from film to film, but I remember Jim Morris, who was running ILM at the time, told me that Dragonheart had caught George's eye, and then Men in Black. And I was the supervisor, the animation supervisor of Men in Black. And that's the first time I got to meet George. Jim brought him by my office, and then right across the hall from me was a little viewing room. And Jim asked me to take George through all the digital characters we'd done for Men in Black. And I gather between what ILM had done on Dragonheart and what we were doing on Men in Black convinced George that the time was right to do Phantom Menace, that he'd always wanted to be freed of the rod puppets and animatronics and things like that. He wanted to be able to have the characters run around and do what he wanted them to do, and computer graphics could do that. So just like Hal, right place, right time with the right skills.
Yeah, I had heard that part of the impetus that got George driving toward creating the prequels was the fact that the technology felt like it had caught up to what he wanted to be able to do from a storytelling perspective.
Yeah.
Which is great. And that a lot of that is all part of the great documentation that's been involved in Phantom Menace. It's been, we were talking a little bit before about the documentary in the beginning is almost as much one of my favorite things to watch as the movie itself. But it being one of the most documented films that I can think of, what are some of the stories that you think may not get enough attention? What are some of the things that you recall when you look back on working on Phantom Menace?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is we had a weekly production meeting with Chrissy England, who's the main producer, and then there were producers for each of the units. The units were run by the supervisors, so we had John Knoll and Scott Squires and Dennis Murin, and they had a producer each, and then myself as the overall animation director. And we'd have a lunch meeting, I'm thinking it was on Wednesdays, and there was only one item on the list every week to discuss. Can we get the movie done? And for months, like if maybe not even a year, can we get the movie done? No was the answer. And the reason it was no, and I can use one example, is that in the script there's a line that says something like, the Gungan army marches out to war. We didn't have a crowd system. We couldn't load up more than 10 characters in our scene. It would freeze, it would crash. We couldn't do it. So the geniuses in the R&D department, software, were feverishly trying to write stuff for us to do it. Meanwhile, those of us in the animation department, and me in particular, who was having sleepless nights, started figuring out, well, let's just create little animated vignettes, meaning little bits of action, droids fighting Gungans, just like 3-5 of them together that we could place and spin around. And so from a camera angle, they could look different and we could populate, but we didn't have any way to do it. So I don't think that's covered in the documentary. Those were private conversations, because we certainly well, there was a certain amount of stress, let's just say, in terms of not wanting to let down George, and panicking a little bit that we didn't actually have the tools to do what we said we could do.
It was a 2,000 shot show, right, Rob? Around that.
Yeah.
And there'd never been a visual effects project close to that. In fact, at that point in time, a really big show might be 250 shots.
That's right. That's right. Men in Black was 200 shots, so I was supervising 200 shots, and then suddenly my next show was 2,000 shots. The scale was just off the chart.
There was no, and yeah, that was only one of many daunting challenges about it. But the scale of the work, the volume, was sheer terror for pretty much everyone. For sure. I mean, Jurassic Park, only 5 years before, or whatever, had fewer than 50 digital dinosaur shots in it.
That's right.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, like 50 something shots. Yeah.
So
and I was told that like the topology, the number of point spans that it took to build the T-Rex was equivalent to what was going to be just on Draco's head in 1995-96. And so the technology innovation was rapidly accelerating to be able to take on the volume and to have acting, performing characters, speaking characters. So we had done that with the Dragon and a little bit in Men in Black. But really, this is a big leap for us to have engaging characters with personality that were holding their own against Liam Neeson and Ewan McGregor and Natalie Portman. So that was a big deal for us. So then a steep learning curve for a lot of the animators, and myself included. Making sure that I was listening to what George wanted out of the shot, out of the scene, what was the arc of that character at that moment. Certainly standing on the shoulders of the voice actor, but then imagining what they, how they would be in their body and moving around.
There's also a huge practical effects show. There's more miniatures, I think, in Phantom Menace than there are in all of the original trilogy films. I've been told. And I believe it because there was a ton of miniature work on that film.
Yeah, we called them Biggie chairs because they were really huge, like the pod arena and the city of Naboo, which just took up huge space outside when they were shooting them. Amazing miniatures.
Yeah, really cool stuff.
Go ahead, Pete.
No, I was just gonna say, Hal, what about yourself? Do you have are there any things that you feel like any stories that just sort of stick with you as to what kind of made it, maybe a little more unique, other than the fact that it was the return to Star Wars? And
the stuff I tend to remember is just really personal stuff. Like Rob being the animation director across all three of the prequels, let alone just Phantom Menace, had a lot of FaceTime with George, but most of us animators didn't, for the usual reasons. But I would try to be in the big reviews that George was in as much as possible, some rows back, but listening, trying to hear everything that was said, just because I wanted to hear how he expressed himself and how he gave his direction to Rob or to John Knoll or to Dennis, whoever he was talking to about a shot. And I remember one day they were looking at, it was fully rendered shots of Nass, and George commented on something. He used the word animation, but something about the context of the sentence made me think that he actually didn't literally mean the motion of the character. He meant some other aspect, whether it was the lighting or something was making it look animated or something. It wasn't really clear. After the review, I saw George crossing the parking lot, and I thought, I have a legitimate work question, George, and by God, I am taking this opportunity. So I walked over to him. I said, hey, I'm leading the animation on the Boss Nass shots, and you had a note about blah, blah. And he was like, oh yeah, no, it's not the acting, it's not the movement. That's fine. It was, whatever it was. And I was like, all right, great, thanks. But like that moment for him, that was like a nothing moment. That was like one of the ILM guys had a question, whatever. It's gone from his mind. The second, the conversation. For me, it was like, I just spoke to George Lucas. Like, it was like a huge moment for me. I was like practically vibrating, and it was just such an anodyne, mundane question, just, you know, the most nothing thing. But for me, it was like, oh my God, what I think I love the most about it was that it wasn't a fan moment. It was like I had a work I'm making a movie with George Lucas, and I had a work question for him, and I asked it. Like, it was so huge.
But there was one other moment, Hal. So a lot of the animators had asked me, you know, could you bring George around? And we had the animators in the big building, and George is pretty shy, actually. He's not very talkative in a crowd. You get him in an editing room with 2 people, and he's talking all the time, but he kind of gets overwhelmed when there's lots of people around. So I waited for my moment, and I made a little request, and I said, look, the team would just, if I could just walk you through the space and they could see you and maybe a hello, or I'll introduce you to people. And he said, oh yeah, okay, I'll do that. So I was walking them through the space, and we come to Hal's desk, and he's got all his toys and robots. Some of them are behind him right now. And he's got a little thing framed. So I'm going to hand it to Hal to tell the bit about what was framed and what happened next.
Oh, I had a letter that I'd written to Lucasfilm when I was 13. After the first film had come out and it had been announced in the press that they were going to make a sequel, I'd written Lucasfilm with my bright ideas for what that should be, and questions about how I might get into filmmaking and work for them one day. And I'd gotten a very nice, you know, sort of, we're not reading your story ideas because we, you know, our lawyers have advice, you know, we have writers working on, and getting into movies takes a combination of talent and luck. And, you know, it was nice and basic, and, you know, this sort of thing. Although it was typed up by Gary Kurtz's secretary, Bunny Alsop, which, as I got older and understood a little more, I was like, that's kind of cool. Like, it's the producer's assistant secretary wrote this herself, typed it up on a typewriter on this cool Ralph McQuarrie letterhead. It's really cool. Anyways, so I framed it. It's behind my desk, and so George signed it for me, and he underlined.
Well, yeah, but first, so it's framed, it's under glass, and George says to you, take that off the wall. And you're like, what? You take it off the wall. It's behind glass. And then George says, take it out of the frame. So you're like taking it out of the frame, and then you hand him the letter, and what's he do?
Yeah, he underlined talent and luck and wrote, you have it, and signed it. He chuckled.
Wow.
First he read it, and he kind of did one of those, and then he signed it. So it was great.
It was so awesome. It was unplanned, and it was so generous, and like George was actually reading it and then made, you know, the decision to do that for Hal, and who we didn't know very well at this point. So I just love that moment. So that's something that obviously didn't show up in the documentary, but that was something. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, there it is.
There's the letterhead.
That.
And
Wow.
there's the signature and where he's underlined it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
Talent.
So cool.
It went back in the frame.
Yeah.
Definitely went back in the frame.
Nicer frame.
Yeah, good place of prominence for that. Well, I want to talk a little bit about evolution, and we've hit on this topic a little bit. And the first thing I wanted to kind of point out was how you talked about working on the Droidekas, and, you know, for us early in the movie, seeing that, like, that was a huge jump from what we had really seen droids do in Star Wars. All of a sudden you have this thing that rolls and like was smooth and fluid. And that was different even than, you know, seeing the protocol droid that greets them, you know, at the beginning in the room and all of that. And then Rob, you talk about, you know, those crowd shots, the Gungan War, and, you know, being able to see how these technologies evolved. So what you have in one, and certainly Rob, you can speak to this, going all the way through 1, 2, and 3, like how fast did that technology evolve and continue to evolve from when y'all started looking at, hey, this is, you know, Aragon or Dragonheart, or gives it, you know, this gets the green light going, and then you take off.
Yeah. Look, I think ILM's always been about innovation and pushing the envelope and being asked to do the impossible. You know, if we rewind back through the computer graphics, you think of like Terminator 2, The Abyss, Terminator 2, Jurassic Park. You know, you look at what was done by ILM before Hal and I got there. And then once we knew that George was back and then had a series of films he wanted to do, a lot of people were super excited and motivated, not only in the animation and the lighting and compositing and everything else, but in the R&D and technology side of things. So there was always a big ask from movie to movie to movie in terms of what we needed to do, and whether it was the rendering and the fidelity of the skin. I remember cloth was something that really got developed, because although we didn't know it when we were making Phantom Menace, we had to have cloth for Yoda in Attack of the Clones. So that was a big development for us. But so it was across all departments, and I did sit at that point. I was sitting on the technical steering committee. There was a selection of folks across all departments, and I remember we would shows would come and present their needs, and then we would prioritize them, and then sit with the technology folks, and then decide. Okay, we've got a huge water show. Perfect Storm's coming. We have to do water. Water has to be something, and we can't pay for it for that one show, but we know we're going to use it on all the next shows. So, as we think of the prequels, we have a whole water planet that we have to be able to do, right? So we stand on the shoulders of the shows that came before us, and we innovate as we go along, and we highlight the things that we need to work on. And that was it was going like leaps and bounds during the prequel years.
You talk a little bit more about sort of the evolution, how quickly the things evolved from episode 1 to 2 to 3, and was, as you just referenced, were there any particular movies that kind of helped to bring something to life in episode 2, for example?
So it's going to the Wayback Machine. Where I'm pausing right now is I can't remember. So we were using Softimage to animate the characters in Phantom Menace, and we were using a facial system that had been developed on Dragonheart called Carrie, short for caricature, which was written by Carrie Phillips, who's still with the company. And it was the secret sauce for me. I mean, it was just allowed us to move the face around in real time. Where on Dragonheart, before we got Carrie, you'd move it and you'd wait, and the points would pop across, and you go, oh, too much, and you pull it back. But with Carrie, it was smooth, and so you could do more iterations per day, per week, and your work got better because you could see it over and over again and put the polish on it. So that tool was incredibly important for us. But I don't remember, maybe how you remember, is when we switched to Maya. So Softimage was ending its life cycle. Maya was used on the pod race for the destruction of the vehicles, but we were absolutely using Softimage for the facial. What I don't remember is whether we switched for Attack of the Clones or Revenge of the Sith, but I remember it was a big change. All the animators had to be trained up on Maya. All our tools had to change. It was an important and strategic decision. It was like, no, we got to jump now, because we're going to be able to do all these other things that we couldn't do or wouldn't be able to do in a software that wasn't being developed any further. So that was a huge thing.
Yeah, that was a big change. Carrie was a really remarkable piece of software, by the way. Rob mentioned that. It was, for a long while, it was where we did all the fleshy stuff. We do the pantomime of the character, either in first Softimage and later in Maya, but all the flesh, like the facial expressions, all that stuff was done in this other piece of software that was written internally at ILM. It's called Carrie, and it was just blazing fast and had a lot of great features, and I just really appreciated that program. In fact, I think in some ways, as our sort of animation tool set has matured, and we moved into Maya, and then we actually ended up moving that part of our animation into Maya. I think in some ways we've compromised it. Like there are aspects of the old Carrie software that I still miss. But it's just natural. But the other things to point to that are easy to see, kind of the increase in complexity and abilities, was cloth simulation, which you mentioned, Rob, because I remember distinctly on Phantom Menace, for instance, Boss Nass has his long robe, and we had to simulate that. But compared to what we do now, it was pretty basic cloth simulation. And it looks a little simple to me now, but it was really hard to do then, super hard to do. And we didn't do a lot of it on Phantom Menace. What other things might we have done? We had that one little shot of Yoda talking to Obi-Wan that maybe needed it, and I'm trying to think, not a lot. Anyways, but on episode 2, we had lots of Jedi robes and things to do. With Yoda fighting Dooku and with Obi-Wan fighting Jango Fett. There were digital shots of Obi-Wan in there where it's supposed to be wet cloth, and his robes are soaked, and some of those shots were digital. And I just remember thinking, wow, this has really come a long way just from chapter 1 to chapter 2. And then of course it was better still in chapter 3. We were also, I think Phantom Menace, was that our first mocap show, Rob, for the battle droids? So we hadn't used motion capture before for characters. That was new, a little scary for the animators, because I thought maybe folks were going to start wanting to use that for all characters, regardless of dinosaurs and everything else. And that didn't really turn out to be the case. It became just another tool in our toolkit, but that was new.
That actually the motion capture it was accelerated and came about because the initial plan, and you can see it in the behind the scenes, was that Ahmed Best was wearing the Jar Jar costume, and if you look carefully, you'll see little green LEDs around his neck, and that we ILM were only going to be adding his head and his ears. But that proved incredibly difficult. They had sent an early shot over to us at ILM. John Knoll was over in England shooting, and I had asked Lou Della Rosa, our Jar Jar lead, to match and animate the head. And the problem was, even though they tightly moved it, human eyes are really good at seeing little imperfections.
Right.
And if you think of the three-dimensional space, so Ahmed's moving around and being himself, that neck had to track absolutely pixel perfect, and we couldn't get it pixel perfect. So you could perceive the neck sliding against Ahmed's actual body. So at the same time, once we realized that was going to be a big problem, I asked Lou to animate the same shot, matching Ahmed, rotoscoping, basically, copying what he was doing, and have a full digital Jar Jar, because we knew we already built a full digital Jar Jar, because we knew there were going to be stunt shots or difficult shots physically that Ahmed wouldn't be able to do. So we had one built already, and Lou was able to knock that out in a fraction of the time because he was free of any constraints. I remember taking both of those clips over to England to show them to George, as well as an early Watto test. And it was there that we made a pitch, John Knoll and I, that Jar Jar be fully digital. And George was resistant, and rightly so, because he had cast Ahmed because of his physicality and his comedy and everything he could do. And George was concerned, rightly so, that a bunch of animators weren't going to be able to do that. And so that's when the pitch was, well, we could put Ahmed in a motion capture suit. We could capture him in three-dimensional space, and we can either use that exactly, or we can take inspiration out of it or keyframes out of it. And so that's how our first prototypes were for Ahmed. And then once we had those tools, then it made perfect sense to do the battle droids. And we continued developing that system as well. But that was a big innovation for Phantom Menace.
That's fantastic. I talk a lot about, without Phantom Menace, without Jar Jar Binks, you don't get a lot of things that we have now. I mean, there's so many great fully computer animated characters that you don't even realize are fully computer animated now. And I guess it also sounds like it was the beginnings of sort of working with physical puppets and incorporating some digital augmentation at the time as well, right? Is that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of the way now, I guess, with Grogu and others. And so it leads me to one of our final questions. You two have both continued to be very engaged in the current state of Star Wars. What do you think is different, especially as we now have things like the volume and an organization like ILM that is so rooted in 1977 and the things that it took to the innovation it took to break ground there, and create things that never existed. And now you're in the television world where things like stagecraft and like are playing a bigger part. But do you find it overall any different now creating a television show or a movie?
Hal, you want to jump on that one?
Sure. I can tell you easily, hands down, the biggest difference between working on a Star Wars film and working on any of the streaming shows is the volume of work, which isn't a very exciting answer, but it's hands down the biggest difference. On a big visual effects summer tentpole film, we might have 2,500 or pushing 3,000 shots, depending on the movie and the cutting style and how long the movie is. But 2,500 shots is kind of a usual number for a show that size, and we might do those effects in 8 months to a year and a half, depending on the schedule of the show and all that. On a single season of The Mandalorian, we're doing about 5,000 visual effects shots, and we do them in roughly the same amount of time. So that is hands down for me the biggest challenge on those shows, is how to manage all that work at a high level, because we don't have like a part of ILM that does like lesser work for streaming than we do for movies. Right. We just do the same quality level that we do. We just have to find a way to manage the work and fit it into the box of the schedule and the budgets and stuff for streaming. So that's the biggest challenge. But there's other exciting things, like the volume is really cool. But that's part of what Rob was talking about ILM, just always kind of innovating and looking for new ways to do things. And it's always great when we have a director who's keen to do that, which Favreau clearly is. He's been innovating for a while with projects like Jungle Book and Lion King before The Mandalorian, where he was experimenting with different forms of virtual production, and that carried on into partnering with us to create the volume for Mandalorian. And honestly, that's another thing that I really enjoy about the streaming world is actually getting to work with a bunch of different directors on a season, rather than, because I love working with directors and getting to know directors is one of my favorite parts of the job. But on a feature, you meet one director and you kind of partner with them, which is great and it's rewarding and all that. But on the fun thing about a streaming show is you might get 4 or 5 different directors over a whole season that you get to know and get to learn from and rub elbows with, and so that's been really fun. And then Mandalorian's the first streaming work I've ever done. I hadn't worked on any TV stuff. We still call it TV stuff, but it's such a different world now. It's but yeah, it's the first thing I've worked on in that world.
Cool. What about you, Rob? Any thoughts?
Well, ILM has grown enormously since the days when we were doing Phantom Menace. So we've got 5 studios around the world, and these streaming shows are parceled up and sent to the 5 different studios. So that's a different way of working than we were working in the old days. We always have a main supervisor, an overall supervisor who's reviewing the work, but then we have subsets in each of the locations. And we do have good crossover between Australia and California. So my team here is always in daily contact with the team in San Francisco or Vancouver. So that's a different way for us to work. But it is about the efficiencies, and it's about leveraging everything we've learned over all the movies. And so there's actually a Star Wars council. They have regular meetings where they share best practices, and they also have a whole presentation that they show to these new episodic directors who come in, so they also understand. So it's always about helping the filmmakers understand our world so that we can help with their vision. So it is fun having more turnover between the directors. So you're getting a different flavor of Star Wars from these different folks. So that's a lot of fun. But I can speak from the Sydney team. They love working on these shows. I mean, we still have a large percentage of our crew that are now like less than half my age, but they have come because Star Wars at some point in their life has touched them and they want to be part of that. So we've got a lot of really enthusiastic people who were like, put their hands up, I want to work on the next one. And so that's great.
Yeah, you have that experience where someone will come up to you in the hallway and say, "Oh, Attack of the Clones was the first movie I ever saw in a theater with my parents. I was 6 years old." And, and I just look at them and say, "That's deeply hurtful. Never say anything like this again." I don't want to know how I don't want to know that I'm that old. Please never say that again.
Well,
I see that as passing the baton because I did that to Joe Johnston not too long ago. I had a chance to meet Joe on a call, and it was a little bit of a fanboy moment. And I told him how old I was when Star Wars came out, and he was like, "Yeah, thanks a lot for that." You know, I was 13 and I'm 60 now. You know, it's like, oh my god.
That's awesome. Well, that's actually the perfect transition as we get ready to wrap this up. First, we want to thank you guys both for taking some time to talk to us today. We are doing this for Podathon. We're raising money for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. You're talking about kids, and Pete and I were college and a little bit older when Phantom Menace came out. But Phantom Menace is, as you exactly just said, both of you, Phantom Menace and the prequels were a key part of introducing new generations of kids to Star Wars, and that's obviously what Star Wars is about kids. As we're focusing on Make-A-Wish today, you mentioned something briefly, Rob, before we got on. Have y'all had any experiences with Make-A-Wish, either, having Wish kids come through, working on other projects that were connected with it? We'd love y'all to share that before we get out of here.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we had the opportunity to meet some wonderful kids who came through ILM and Lucasfilm when I was working on the prequels. The films have touched generations of kids now, and so to be asked to be part of that was an honor, and to share some of what we were doing because these kids wanted to see behind the scenes, or they wanted to go up to Skywalker Ranch. And the team at Lucasfilm was always about, these kids, these are priorities, we need to have them in, give them the royal treatment. And so it was really touching to be someone who got to actually meet with them and interact with them and share a little bit of the magic of what we do.
Absolutely. Hal, what about you?
Well, sadly, I haven't had the privilege of participating directly in one of those visits yet, but I would love to one day. I'm well aware of what the program is, and I'm happy as a clam to be participating in this today. But yeah, I'd love to welcome some kids sometime and show them around and do that kind of thing. That'd be great. Be super fun.
For sure. And I'm sure that opportunity will come your way. Again, we can't thank both of you enough for being a part of this day. It is such an honor for us to get to put together this event. It's all for Make-A-Wish. Everybody that's watching, you can go to the link on the bottom. You can scan the QR code that's down there. All of your money goes directly to Make-A-Wish through our fundraising link. It doesn't come to us. And the biggest thing is you're going to help make wishes come true. So thank everybody for tuning in. Rob and Hal, thank you for being a part of this. And Pete, may the force be with you.
Always.